Hello, everybody, and hello, Mr. Gurría. Thank you very much for your time for this virtual fireside chat. I'd like to start by asking you around this central theme of global inequality. You clearly have a very distinctive perspective on this. You've been doing your job as head of the OECD for almost 15 years now. You took over in 2006 in a very different world before the financial crisis and everything else that has followed. Can you tell us how you see the evolution of inequality as one of the major economic stories of our times?
Inequality was already growing before the 2008-2009 crisis. But it was, let's say, growing very gradually, and it was not perceived to be a very great challenge at that time. The crisis just catapulted the question of inequality into the center of the analysis and of the problems. I remember in 2008, we published something called Growing Unequal. Well, putting the question of inequality and putting the question of inequity and putting the question of the polarization of revenue and wealth as part of the problems in the analysis. And in 2011, we unfortunately took out the question mark. We could confirm that inequalities were moving so fast or advancing so rapidly, and that the crisis had made them just accelerate. We wrote something called Divided We Stand, playing on the words of the hymn, We Stand. So Divided We Stand, that was 2011. And then in 2015, wrote one called In It Together, which was tracking the problems of the inequality, mostly to the labor market, and to the problems of the labor market, the unemployed, but also the fact that wages were flat for a very long time, while, of course, the remuneration to capital had been privileged, etc. Now, we also published the year after something called the Broken Social Elevator, precisely to signify the fact that the capillarity that normally would happen is not happening. That the social elevator that takes you to, a better place than where you started was not happening. That is broken. That's actually not doing what it was supposed to do. And then we published something called the Squeezed Middle Class, because it's all about getting people into the middle class. And we wrote a piece that basically documented the fact that staying in the middle class, that being middle class was harder and harder for the middle class, because it was so expensive vis-a-vis the increases of your revenue, that education, that all sorts of health expenses, and also housing, very importantly housing, leisure, etc., were growing much faster than the revenue of the middle class. And therefore, you could see the middle class. This is why we call it the squeezed middle class. So basically, we documented the fact that there were the middle class on average was about 3 months of revenue, 3 to 4 months of revenue away from not being middle class anymore. So very, very vulnerable. A lot of the middle class were very vulnerable. So this is the problem, and it continues to accumulate. And then what happens is that the COVID just exacerbated the process for a number of reasons that we'll talk about.
Yes, I mean, to zero in on that, clearly pandemic, apart from everything else, has had a savage effect on inequality, throwing many people out of work. And we are already seeing some of the effects of that, and of course many more will become apparent as government schemes, support schemes for businesses and individuals are scaled back or removed altogether. How do you think policymakers should be responding to this crisis that is affecting so many people worldwide and driving people who were poorer anyway into even worse poverty, and people who maybe were doing okay before into poverty perhaps for the first time in their lives?
Michael, the first thing to do is to ask the right question. And it is a false dilemma to have to choose between lives and livelihoods. It's very simple. You have to throw everything you got and the kitchen sink, at the virus. Beat the virus. Kill the not only, by the way, with the vaccine, but also by all the other things that we know, by washing, by keeping the social distance, and by avoiding conglomerations and teleworking, and, selectively closing some sectors, as has been the choice in this second wave, because you basically will gain not only in terms of the ethical, the moral side, which is to save lives, to save people from getting sick, but also the sooner you're able to beat the virus, then the less expensive the consequences of the virus will be. The less money you will have to throw at the consequences. And also because the consequences are not exclusively economic and financial, they're also social. And the scarring effect can last a long time. Long after the virus is gone or dominated, you're gonna be suffering the consequences. So basically, hit it with everything you got, including at this time, flexibility. Well, we've seen it from the central banks, but also from the treasuries in terms of not looking at the rule book these days. You have very low interest rates, so that can attenuate the effort of getting some more debt on your books. Everybody's going to end up with more debt in their books after this year and next year. But still, remember that when you're doing debt to GDP ratios, it's a ratio, and that the denominator is the GDP. And without the enormous injections of resources that have been made, then the GDP would have probably dropped even further, maybe dropped by double the amount that it actually dropped. So I think in that sense, we should look at the alternative. What if we had not done what we did?
And clearly, there is to be a massive bill from all of this that will have to be funded in some way. And there's a big question already, isn't there, of how is the burden going to be shared between individuals and companies, between older generations and younger generations, between asset owners and working people? These are clearly big questions which have a huge bearing on inequalities that we see already. How do you see the big picture and how the bill for the pandemic should be paid?
Well, first of all, you are going to have to dedicate, just like, you're talking with vaccines. The first batch of vaccine, where does it go? Here you see, the first batch of resources. Where does it go? Well, it has to go to the ones that have been hardest hit. And that is, we know all the reasons why women have been hardest hit. because they're in their front lines and because they have to take care of the children, and because sometimes the children are not even in school because of the pandemic itself. Therefore, they have to take care of the children, and they have to cook, and they have to clean, and they also have to do their job, which many cases is in the front line, being a doctor, being a nurse, being a paramedic, etc., helping the process. And we have seen the women, we have seen minorities being hardest hit. We have seen the students being, suffering from the consequences of the pandemic and of opportunities, moving from students to jobs, and then children. There's a moment when we had 1.6 billion with a B, the children and young men and women who were out of school unwillingly, and which either did not have connectivity, did not have the tools, meaning the PCs or whatever it is, their tablets, whatever it was, and did not have, when they had connectivity and they had the tablets, they did not have the teachers. So you basically are having a whole 3 years, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months of lost classes, or the quality of the classes. And then it was straddling an academic year, because it started, it's still going on actually, to a very great extent. So it's already straddling 2 academic years, so it's affecting the 2 academic years. So it's a very serious impact. But you're having the low skilled, Michael, the low skilled. This is a crisis where the low skilled are going to find themselves in much greater difficulty to plug in, to reconnect with the labor markets, because what we know for sure is that the post-COVID world is going to be more digital. The ones that do not have the digital skills are going to suffer more. So the governments are going to have to put in a lot of effort precisely to do, and companies themselves, in order to train or retrain or upskill their own staffs. So you have the women, you have the elderly, you have the young, you have the children, you have the low skilled. You just have very, very important groups that are being affected very seriously in their outlooks.
You mentioned digital there. I'd like to focus on that as a very concrete example of the inequality debate we're talking about. Clearly, the taxation of digital companies was very high on the agenda before the pandemic, and the question of fair taxation for very large companies which are making huge profits across borders and in some cases not paying a great deal of tax. This has clearly been something that the OECD in particular has been looking at. We've seen many digital companies doing very well during the pandemic because, for the obvious reasons, that people are confined much more at home and ordering online. Does this change and make even more urgent the debate on digital taxation and the reform of it? And if so, where do you see things going from here?
It does not make the debate more urgent. It makes a solution more urgent. It makes a decision more urgent. And all the elements of the decision are on the table, because we have worked on them for the better part of 3 years now. and we were making a lot of progress, and then we got stalled in the last year because of a number of interactions, and because we were, well, first of all, COVID made it much more difficult to simply talk to people, and also to talk in terms of negotiation, talk in terms of to say, okay, what if, you know, you give a here, you give a word there, put it, we add a word there, or we put it in the whatever, you know, the kinds of solutions that are, well, part and parcel of any final design. That has been very difficult. Also, as you know very well, the United States asked that there be this consideration of the so-called safe harbor. So fortunately, the 137 members of the inclusive framework that are working on this, including, by the way, the United States, said, okay, we have this concern, we have this proposal, so let's park it here and let's continue to work on all the elements. So I would say what we have done is lost 6 months. It's not a lot in terms of the enormous achievement that this could be. And why is it that it's not the better option, but the only option? For the very simple reason, number one, that as we have seen, if everybody goes out on their own, you will have 20, 30, 40 countries going out and falling under the imperative of taxing the growing digitalization of the economy in their countries, like everywhere else in the world. And if a particular country, i.e. the United States, perceives that this is against their own companies, already there has been, an analysis about the 301 and these rules and regulations that apply when there is a perception that this is addressed against a particular set of companies in a single country. That is, the United States then reserves the right to retaliation on the trade side. Now, the problem is that this is not against France, as was the case last year, because when you're dealing with trade, when you're dealing with tariffs, you're dealing with the European Union, with the European Commission. So basically, you're talking about all the countries in Europe, but also you're talking about many countries not in Europe. And in Europe, you're talking about at least 5, 6, 7, which already started the process and may have already legislated, but are keeping right now the final decision of implementation. So the alternative is more trade tension, more trade. The last thing we need when we're going for a recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. The other thing is that we're looking at creating, it was before the COVID, we already had a very flat growth trade and a very flat growth of investment. We need to undo that. Those wrongs, the damage that was caused to the economy even before COVID. Why? Because this year we're going to have, and still today, we are negative in terms of the level of trade vis-a-vis the year before. But also investment has dropped even by further than trade, which means these are the elements of growth. That means growth is basically stopped or blocked because of these elements. And the last thing you want is to relive this because we already know the story. We all saw the movie. We don't want to repeat it.
Do you think that the imminent change of administration in the United States will help to push forward this reform process and ease some of these tensions on digital taxation trade?
I think that believing that it only takes a change in administration may be wishful thinking, but may not be quite accurate in terms of pointing towards a solution. Why? Because the perception that a number of companies, which are mostly Americans, and therefore that bilateral solutions may not be acceptable, is shared by both sides of the aisle. This is not just a question of politics on one party or politics of the other. This is shared. We have received letters from legislators and from senators on both parties. So the question is that is also the other part why we should move into an agreed internationally agreed solution. And last but not least, Michael, you mentioned it in the beginning. You were saying they've done so well. Yes, they have done so well, and they're the only ones who have done so well. And therefore, who are the governments going to go to and try to get, the pound of flesh? If not those that are doing not only well, but very well, that have doubled their capitalization in 6 months, et cetera, et cetera. So what better for them, the companies, than having a legal certainty about a reasonable, balanced, internationally agreed solution that can then be applied throughout the world with criteria that are roughly the same in every country and that will avoid arbitrariness. So here you have a situation where the companies themselves should be the first ones to be insisting on the international solution because it's the best for them.
I'd like to turn to climate change. This is clearly another great, apart from being a worldwide crisis, is something that also magnifies existing inequalities. For obvious reasons, the pandemic has taken attention away from global heating, but it's also perhaps undermined some of the measures potentially being taken to address it, such as, for example, deterring people from going on public transport because of the risk of infection. How should policymakers be bringing the climate change debate, the global heating debate, back center stage again? And how should they be adapting it to what has happened during the pandemic?
Our single most urgent, most immediate, most imminent task is to focus on the virus, focus on the pandemic, and beat it. Just beat it. Through both, the vaccines and policy measures, and people's discipline, people's conviction that we all have to contribute to the solution. So that is the urgent task, the emergent task, but the single most important intergenerational responsibility is to protect the planet, is to take care of the environment, to fight climate change, to protect, preserve biodiversity, water in general, every single bit of water that we have of all types. And by the way, special concern for the oceans where we're killing the oceans by dropping waste and by overfishing or by plastics. The quality of the air, the quality of the soil, the preservation of soil, all these things are the most important intergenerational responsibility. Problem, the decisions we take today are going to affect in 20 years, in 30 years, in 40 years. And therefore, today we have to be taking decisions with 2040 and 2050 in our sights. And we have, again, to take care of the planet while we are fighting the pandemic. It is not a question of saying, because of the immediacy of the pandemic, that we're going to neglect this other crucial obligation.
Time is running short. I'd like to close with a broader question, which again looks back at your long experience. There's a growing constituency in the world which says that globalization is something that has widened inequality, and it is essentially a god, a financial and economic god that has failed. Is that so?
No, absolutely. Don't blame globalization for the bad policies of governments. Don't blame globalization for the fact that there has been trade tension, for the fact that we have smothered or decimated investment flows, and also that we're not acting multilaterally. How do you deal with trade if not multilaterally, when by definition trade is across borders? And how do you deal with investment flows if not globally, because it's a global phenomenon? How do you deal with climate change? How do you deal with the protection of biodiversity? How do you deal with migration? And Michael, how do you deal with a pandemic? This is the single most globalized phenomenon ever, because it has hit every single country in the world. Even the remotest island has been affected. And therefore, we really have no choice. We are in a situation in which, as I said before, we have to give it all we've got. But what we're having today is, the greatest combined health, economic, social, governance, environmental, all sorts of problems together. Educational problems, we mentioned about that. This is the greatest challenge we've ever faced, and we just have to realize it, but also to have the confidence, to have the hope that we have the elements to beat the virus, and but that it's not going to happen magically. It's not going to happen by itself. That we have to turn the hope into a reality, and that will take hard work and enlightened public policies.
And how do you restore that confidence in the world economic system? I mean, it takes major reforms from here, doesn't it? I mean, there's a widespread sense that the old model has been discredited in fundamental ways.
Results, results, results. I don't think that we are any longer in a situation where the promises will go very far. I think we have to be better at communication. We have to be better at explaining why it is that we expect people to behave in a certain way. And then why people should themselves behave in a certain way, because it's not about them. You know, those who say, I should be free to wear a mask or not. No, it's not about you. It's about the rest of the people around you that, you may be infecting, that you're going to be causing contagion, that may die, even if you are asymptomatic. So basically, it's about telling people what they can expect, not generating an inflated expectation, but also never failing to say, yes, if you work, if we work, and if everybody works together, we will beat this phenomenon. We will beat this pandemic. Because I think right now, if anything, for the wrong reasons, Michael, but perhaps now most of the people, if not all, but most of the people are convinced that, there's only one way to go. And that, by the way, includes getting vaccinated. Because wouldn't it be this more extraordinary paradox that once we have the very much sought after vaccines, almost a year after the problem started, that we would have people who say, no, I will not take it. So yes, we should all move in that direction. And in the meantime, as I said before, 2021 is going to be a very difficult year, because it's going to take to the second to the third quarter of the year before enough people are vaccinated so that you can feel secure.
Mr. Gurría, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.